Hi, good morning. It's quite awesome to be here as a first keynote speaker, and especially if the first keynote speech is on copyright. So I thought, oh boy, the organizers want to play tough this year. I'll try to make it less painful as it usually is to speak about copyright. And I don't want to tell you about the difficulties and how burdensome it is to deal with copyright, because you have more experience than myself probably on these issues. So I don't want to tell you that copyright is meant to foster creation and to enhance investment in creation. I don't want to tell you that only original creations are protected. You all know that. And that not everything is protected, facts, data, information, but also many creations which are not original. And sometimes it's so easy to just stamp a license or just talk of it as a work when it is not. I don't want to tell you, I don't want to teach you that according to the copyright laws, all rights vest in the authors, and this means moral rights to protect personal interests related to the authors, but also exclusive exploitation rights. I don't need to tell you that licensing is the main tool for the exercise of copyright. All kinds of licensing, traditional copyright licensing, but also open, more flexible public licensing. I don't need to tell you that licensing is paramount for the exercise of copyright, but also it's one of the most difficult parts of copyright or of dealing with copyright, knowing the whole chain of title, knowing who owns what, who's entitled to do what, on which terms, for how much time, on which countries. I don't want to tell you that copyright is not unlimited, although sometimes it feels as if it was unlimited. As it happens with all kinds of property, copyright, intellectual property is limited. It is limited in time, and it is limited in scope. Not everything is entitled for the author to authorize or prohibit. In terms of time, the term of protection, we all know well enough that it has been expanding over and over. Our colleagues in the US know very well the fight they had that arrived at the Supreme Court, and we lost, which was an attempt to avoid an overexpansion of copyright, the US copyright term, in order, let me tell you, to make it even with the previously enlarged European copyright term. So sometimes this is not well or not explained well enough. In a market-driven IP world, or in an IP-driven market, it's very important to have the same conditions as a starting point. So it is not strange that the US copyright industry lobbied for a larger, an extension of the term of protection to compete with the European terms of protection. They didn't want their works to be protected for a shorter time than the European counterparts. I'm not going to tell you that once the term of protection is over, the work reverts to the public domain, where it belongs. Let's face it, if there were no copyright law at all in a natural state, in a Rousseauian world, the works would be, from the very beginning, for all to share. There would be no exclusivity right that could entitle anybody, author or owner, to decide who's going to use what and on which terms. I'm not going to tell you that the copyright is limited also in terms of scope. The copyright laws specifically provide for some exclusive, exploitation acts that are directly allowed by the law. These acts are not subject to the author's monopoly. Let me use that hated word. The author cannot decide whether his work will or will not be used for parody purposes, for information purposes, for teaching purposes. This is something that the laws take away from the author. Why? Because the interests of the authors, the interest in protecting IP, is not the only interest that should be taken into account in our societies. There are other fundamental rights, public interests that are as important, if not more important, than copyright. And I know you're all aware of that, but let me tell you that in the copyright academia and the copyright context where I used to move in, this is not stressed enough. We tend to think that copyright is the paramount fundamental right. I don't need to tell you, though, how difficult it is to size the scope of these exempted rights, exempted acts that are statutorily provided. It is very difficult to know what is fair use and what is not a fair use. It is very difficult to know whether a specific teaching use will be covered by a statutory exception or not. It's very difficult to distinguish between an exempted act and an exception, or an exempted act or an infringement. And since the liability may be so costly in economic terms and also in reputation terms, it's very easy to fall in the trap of playing it safe and let's just go and get a license. I don't want to risk it. And this is something that we, me being at the WAC, we distance universities, but I'm sure also physical brick-and-mortar universities tend to play it safe. And I know MIT, for instance, with the open courseware, was spending thousands of dollars, amounts of money, clearing out copyright that perhaps at some points could have been deemed fair use. So I don't want to tell you about all this. You know it well enough. What I want to tell you, and try to make it a little bit more positive, is that we are aware, we copyright professors are aware that the statutorily exempted acts are not enough. And that owners, copyright owners, have been lobbying for years, especially these last 20 years, to make sure that their copyright exclusivity scope, their scope of exclusivity and their copyright will also survive in the digital world. So they've been lobbying, and they got what they wanted. That's what lobbying is for. I want to tell you that as far as teaching and educational purposes, domestic laws are doing a very poor job. And I think this is all responsibility to share. It's true that international norms, when we talk about the Berne Convention, the Universal Copyright Convention, even supranational norms, if we speak in European terms, the directives that come from the European Union Government Commission, all these international norms are very sensitive to education and its needs. They all say that education justifies statutorily or justifies an exemption of the exclusive rights, that the author should have nothing to say about whether his work should be used for education and teaching purposes and research. This is at the international norms, but then copyright is territorial. These international norms just stay there in heaven. They don't come down to earth. And then domestic laws, just forget about education. And if you're interested in this topic, I can refer to you to the WIPO conducted last year a comparative law study of how educational needs and purposes were treated in all domestic copyright laws. I was doing one of these reports. They are all posted online, and the result is really not to be satisfied, at least. I don't want to be negative, but there's so much work to be done. So in this scenario, is there any hope for education? Is there any hope for copyright and education? I do think so. I think there's hope, but we need to work on it. We need to pay attention to the law. Copyright is so complicated. Copyright has been driven away from the users and the educational needs, that we have found other methods, other forms of dealing with copyright, the licensing. And that was the way to do it, because if you cannot change the law, just find the tools that are there available to make, to meet, to obtain the goals that you are seeking. But at the end, the law will catch us will catch us up. We cannot live in a lawless world. We don't live in a lawless world. The licensing is enabled because we have a copyright law. And if we don't like the deal the law is currently cutting for us, I think it's our responsibility not to look somewhere else, to look at the law and try to fix it. And I've been trying to, whenever I have the possibility to talk to a university educational context, I always try to make this point that we are responsible for the laws we have. The law is a social agreement. It's not something decided by God. We make the laws we have. So what I was saying, if we don't like the law we have, we should just do something to change it. As I was saying, it's wonderful that we have been using open licensing. It was the way to go. It's been a blessing for education. You're all aware of it. But it's not the ultimate solution, because licensing can only take us that far. Because at the end, there will always be works that have not been licensed, and despite that, we would like to use them for teaching and educational purposes. So we should pay attention to the law, because there's a lot of work that can be done in the law that could make our lives and the whole society's interest much easier. And I'm always saying, of course it's difficult to live in a copyrighted world. We would all like to be in this natural state where everything goes and we all enjoy the fruits that hang from the trees and we get clean water. But this is not the current world. And copyright may be difficult, but it has some good in it, which is to foster creativity, to foster creation, not creativity. Creativity comes within the human, and we would all be creative no matter what. But if we want to invest in creation, we need some exclusive right that regulates the conditions for getting something out of this investment. And I mean all kinds of investment: intellectual, money, economic, technical investment. So if we agree on that, and we agree that we need copyright, but we don't like the copyright law that we have, then it's our duty to change it. And I'm always saying it's difficult to live in a copyrighted world, but it's far more difficult and complex to live in a fully licensed world. Trust me. Licenses are difficult to tackle. It's much easier to have a statutory provision that says you can do anything or this, for teaching purposes, because education is more important than copyright. So copyright should bow to education. So what should we be doing? Well, we should be convincing our legislators, governments, and we all have a part in this fight, that the scope of the exclusive rights as currently stated in the law are too much. They should not cover it all. They should cover something less than it all. Professor Lessig puts it very nicely. It says, copyright should cover something less than it all. We need a healthy public domain. And notice that the public domain I'm referring to is not the licensed commons. Works licensed in the commons license and with a public license, with an open license, is not in the public domain. We should tell the legislators that the scope of the exempted acts is not enough. We cannot have restrictive readings of the exempted acts, mummified in acts, in statutes, and instead have very wide and flexible reading of the exclusive rights. This is not fair. We need flexibility to allow that the exempted acts, the scope of exempted acts in the statutes, will be flexible and accommodating an ever-changing technological society. We need to tell them that the term of protection should not extend beyond what is necessary to recoup the investment made. And this may differ depending on the works. Some works may have longer terms than others. And ultimately, we have to make them understand that copyright laws are not only drafted for the benefit of authors and owners, which are the voices that are currently being heard of in lobbying circles, but that they are there for the benefit of society. Because if we have a healthy creative market, a market of creativity, we all win out of it. We are all a healthier society. So we universities are in a very privileged position to do that, because we have the luxury to say to the legislature that our benefit is the benefit of society at large. Education benefits us all. So we have a big card in our hands. We should just use it rightly. And to just show you that this is possible, let me go back, that I'm not talking about, an imaginary world like, this professor wants to make copyright a nicer, friendlier tool. No, that's never going to be. Let me go back to history and tell you that one of the first copyright laws existing, it was the 1710, the Statute of Anne, which granted, let me read the title, you will understand what I'm talking about. It says, it's an act for the encouragement of learning by vesting copies of printed books in the authors during the times therein mentioned. That statute, 1710, stated, for the advancement of learning, 9 copies of any printed books shall be delivered to the libraries of the universities. And at that time, imagine why 9 copies, because there were only 9 universities in the United Kingdom. So what that law was doing was making sure that any copies of books that were being printed at that time, and trust me, copyright, that's what all copyright was about, just the printing of a book, that's it. Nothing else at that time. That all these universities will get a copy of that book for their use. Of course, I'm not saying that universities should get the books for free, blah, 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 no. But I'm saying that the deal the universities and that education had at that time, over 300 years ago, was much more friendlier. It was a better deal than what we have today. So, just very briefly, before I run out of my time, now that I've said that, let me move back a bit and take a look at the bigger picture, not at the law, but at the international politics of copyright and education. I have good news and bad news. The good news is that as I was pointing out before, all the international declarations are friendly towards education. Education is a fundamental right granted in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and so is the author's right, also a fundamental right. The big difference is that education, everyone is entitled to an education, only authors, creators are entitled to the author's rights. That's a big difference. Doesn't mean that one is better than the other, just a big difference to take into account. International copyright instruments are also very friendly towards educational needs. What I was telling you before, the domestic laws don't pay attention. And since copyright remains territorial, we should be doing something about it. And Another good news is that these international copyright instruments have always been trying to cut a better deal for developing countries. In 1971, at the Paris revision of this Berne Convention, the Berne Convention is an old instrument of end of the 19th century. In a revision that was taking place in Paris in 1971, the concern was already raised as to whether developing countries should be forced to buy the same package that developing countries are, doing with copyright. And as a result from that concern, there was an appendix annexed to the Berne Convention, which entitled Developing Countries that were accessing the Berne Convention to grant non-exclusive compulsory licenses that allowed translation and reproduction of works printed in other countries so that they could be used for teaching purposes and research purposes. Well, the bad news is this beautiful appendix that is sitting there open for developing countries that joined the Berne Convention has only been accepted by 15 members, which means that it remains highly ineffective. More recently, the WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, has adopted the development agenda. That was in 2007. The development agenda concerns also this, or deals also with this concern that developing countries should not be forced to buy the whole IP, developed world IP package, and that IP is a public policy that may have good and bad effects, and that we should be cautious that the IP enforcement in developing countries, the effects of IP enforcement in developing countries is the result of this enforcement is has better results than bad results. We should make sure that the costs are not higher than the benefits of enforcing IP. And it is true, there's some good in enforcing IP also in developing countries. For instance, when we are, as a result of enforcing IP in India, the Bollywood industry, as well as the Hollywood industry, movies being imported in India, is booming because IP enforcement benefits both industries. But what may be wrong and what we may be doing wrong and we should be very careful about is these existing attempts to impose the whole Occidental IP laws onto developing countries as they are. And this is done by means of bilateral agreements. Both the US and the European Unions are very keen on that, and they are forcing that any developing country who wants to make trade, to enter into trade relations with the EU or the US, is obliged to take it or leave it. No negotiation. Is obliged to take all the norms, all the provisions, the IP statutory provisions of European and US copyright laws and adopt it and enforce them. Of course, in some markets, this may have some good effects, but in less market-driven kind of works, this may be a deterrent for copyright. In educational markets, the enforcement of these very harsh IP provisions may be, as I was saying before, the costs may be higher than the benefits. So we should be vigilant on that. And another bad news, at least from what it looks like now, this ACTA, the anti-counterfeiting trade agreement that had been secretly negotiated between the European Union and the US in order to make sure that they would have enforcement actions taken on a global scale I was saying before, copyright is territorial, and so is the enforcement tools tools to enforce copyright are also territorial. Instead, what they are realizing is that counterfeiting, infringement of all kind of industrial property and intellectual property, be it patents, trademarks, medicines, and works, is taking scale at a global, in a global market. So they need the tools to make this enforcement of IP effective. Well, what they are doing, I guess, is trying to move away from these old, useless, non-effective international fora, such as the WIPO and the UN, and make a new fora where they can just, show their teeth and their strength and make sure that nobody infringes copyright. Well, if we go into this world, we should make sure that our laws are well balanced. Otherwise, we will be in real trouble. Educational context will be in trouble. So I'm going to leave it here. What I wanted to say just is that we should be paying more attention to the law, that a lot can and should be done within the laws, within the domestic laws, that education and access to culture deserves to be directly enforced and supported by the law. And it's not enough to have all our efforts devoted to licensing and putting up contents up there if the laws don't help us. So it always makes me sad when I see this big red prohibition sign. When somebody talks about copyright, there's always portrayed with this big red prohibition sign. And I would like to see it become a friendlier sign. Copyright is not only about, I was saying, protecting authors. It's about protecting society at large, making us all richer. And we should make sure that the laws are there to do so. Let me cite that when I was doing this WIPO report, there was one I had a lot of back and forth information with librarians and educators from all over. My part was Europe, the US, and the old ex-socialist republic, the USSR states. And one librarian said, let's put it this way. We should not let that a profit opportunity for a few turns into a wrong for too many. And if we're not vigilant, the laws will not change. If we are not vigilant, the laws will remain doing this bad deal. So we should just focus our attention on them instead of just not paying attention to them. I don't know, and I'll leave it here. I don't know if there's time for questions or maybe at the end after the second present keynote speech. Yeah? Okay, so if there's any question or... I hope I have... Yes?
I'm not an expert in this, but I know that in patent law, you can declare a statutory invention, I think.
Statutory what?
Invention, where you can... Sorry, thanks. In patent law, I believe you can declare your invention to the public in U.S. patent law. Is there no way to do that for copyright law?
Good question. Some claim that in U.S. copyright law you can do that you could put your work in the public domain from the very beginning, that you could say, I don't want my work to be protected. I can tell you that in the European world, in the European context, this is not possible. Copyright is not at the disposal of the author. Maybe it should be. But when copyright laws were drafted, there was this whole perhaps romantic idea that authors needed protection and that they needed these copyright rights. Maybe they don't want to exercise it. And that's perfectly possible. Maybe somebody can create the work and never put it in the market, never exploit it in commercial terms, or you can exploit it for free. But you still have the copyright. You cannot give it up. And the term of protection is what we call public order. It's a mandatory provision. The work is protected for this time. The author cannot choose whether he wants the work to be protected for 20 years or 100 years. It's this time. So no, there's nothing like that. That's one of the things that perhaps for some kind of works we should be.
One follow-up to that.
Good question. Gosh, I don't know. I don't know what's the right amount of time. I do know that different works should have different amount of times. Yes. Think of it this way. It's very different to create a work as part of your teaching activity or to create a work that you have where you have the expectation that you will live upon this work, that you will make a benefit upon this work. When we create teaching materials, we know we're not going to be living out of the teaching materials. We get our revenues from somewhere else, the university or whoever is paying our research. We don't want to make a commercial exploitation of it. Instead, in other kind of works, think of movies, sound recordings, works that require a lot of investment and time to create. Maybe they should have a longer term. How long? Personally, I don't agree with this, perennial extension of copyright, as now they are requesting for sound recordings. Now that the Beatles and all sound recordings are falling into the public domain, we want an extension of the term of the sound recordings. No, I guess the legislature should say enough is enough, and it's only a limited term. How much? Who knows? As I see it now, the 70-year plus the life plus 70 year that we have is too long. I think the third generation, so the grandchildren of the author, doesn't even know what the grandpa was creating. It doesn't even care about enforcing copyright. Maybe second generation would suffice. But it's very difficult to go back once you got the 70 year now. So.
You have proposed that the universities take an active role in addressing the law. And certainly that makes sense from the standpoint that universities are users or consumers of material created by others. But we're also producers of that same material. Mm-hmm. And inside any university, then there's a sort of a schizophrenia between openness and less copyrightable stuff, and then obviously protecting the material that's been produced by the university. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit unclear to me why, say, the Creative Commons license or other analogs of the Creative Commons license, which give people a range of rights to give away to the public, relatively simply with a click, very quick, easy way of putting the license attached to some stuff. Why that and other adjustments that we've made isn't sufficient? What elements in the law would you specifically have changed so that this ideal that you're proposing would be realized?
As from the point of view of the university as the producer of the teaching material, what I'm proposing is that we should claim that the laws should allow us as university, as producers, to use any pre-existing material in our teaching material, regardless of any licensing. The law should empower us to take pre-existing works and use them for teaching, as long as it's, within, you cannot just use the whole book and just use it without paying for it, but just parts of it. Do compilations or without the need of a previous license. Because what is terrible about the system we have now is that the author is allowed to say, no, you cannot use this for teaching purposes. And I think this is a betrayal of copyright and, of course, a betrayal of education. And perhaps you come from, I don't know where you come from, but in Anglo-Saxon countries, in the US and the UK, there's collective licensing in place for teaching needs, and it's remunerated. But this only exists in these 2-3 countries of the world. We have, 300 other countries where nothing like that exists. And the author still has a right to say, no, you cannot use my material for teaching. I think this is bad. I'm not sure if the licensing that you have in place is the right solution for all the other countries. I don't want to venture whether this licensing of pre-existing works for teaching purposes should be remunerated or for free. Developing countries are happier when these sort of statutory exemptions are for free. Perhaps in a European context where this exception has been specifically applied in the statute, it's a remunerated exception. But it's an exception, it's not a license. It's an exception in the sense that the author cannot decide against that use. And I think this is a big step. Because, well, when I was saying that there's two fundamental rights here in the battle, and one is copyright, the author's rights, but the other is education. And if we let authors decide which works are being used for educational purposes and which are not, we are giving them more power than they should have, I think. Did I answer your question? So, well, these topics, I'm sure, with the several panels, you will be revisiting them all, right? So, thank you very much.